When we come back, the latest on another conflict. In Afghanistan, Soviet forces are kept on the move by Muslim rebels who've taken their guerrilla warfare to the outskirts of the capital. Increasing tensions in the Gulf this year have overshadowed the conflict in the region inside Afghanistan. Today, the country's communist leader told his party that it should work towards a coalition with the Muslim rebels trying to bring down the Soviet-backed government. The communists came to power in Afghanistan in 1978, and Soviet forces moved in the following year to quell opposition. Now there are 115,000 Soviet troops in the country, and at least 3 million refugees have crossed the border into Pakistan. The Soviets face resistance from about 200,000 rebels, and British experts say the cost could be £2.5 billion a year. The rebels dominate the countryside, with the Soviets fully controlling only 5 cities, including the capital, Kabul. Even there, though, the rebels are active, as Brian Hanrahan reports.
Night brings the war lapping at the very edge of Kabul, and the outgoing fire demonstrates vividly how closely the guerrillas are pressing on the city's defenses, despite government reluctance to acknowledge it. There's a constant succession of flares and barrages at the perimeter, and occasional explosions inside the city itself. Aircraft taking off hurl out brilliant flares, an attempt to protect themselves from the sophisticated heat-seeking missiles now in the hands of the guerrillas. The missiles, the American Stingers and the British blowpipes are changing the war. With dawn, the first helicopters start their patrols, but they too are vulnerable to missile attack, and they can no longer give their ground forces unchallenged air cover. More of the burden of fighting is falling on the infantry. We watched one mission right on the edge of Kabul. It began with an artillery bombardment of a hillside. Then the helicopters attacked. But instead of hovering and pouring fire on their targets, they darted swiftly in and out, covering their retreat with flares. Afghan officials routinely dismiss all such activity as training, but they stopped us from checking. The danger in the air has forced a change of tactics on the ground. Soviet soldiers are now strengthening the defenses of Kabul. They've taken over the Afghan observation posts in the hills and have started fortifying them. From their strong points, they direct the armored columns which sweep the valleys, trying to keep the Mujahideen out of range of the airport and the city. But fortifying the city means abandoning the countryside. Pagman, just beyond the defenses, has become a no-man's land. It used to be a fashionable resort for the wealthy, but years of fighting have wrecked it. It's supposed to be held by the government with the help of a few armed tribesmen, but at night it's government guns that rake it to keep the guerrillas away. Local officials insist there's been no trouble here for a year, but all the other evidence suggests that the guerrillas are still active in the area, and at night these ruins become their territory. Soviet forces are more than ever pinned down by the war, 8 years after they entered Afghanistan to change the government. Their barracks have become solid, permanent structures, and as the ground fighting intensifies, they're doing more of it. Some selected paratroopers said they'd learned to respect the Mujahideen's fighting ability.
But you see, to underestimate the enemy is just to lose the combat.
Afghan troops are being relegated to bit parts in their own war. They watch the passes into the city and search vehicles for smuggled arms. Soviet officers say the Afghan conscripts lack military skills, and diplomats doubt if they have the stomach for the long, drawn-out war against their fellow countrymen. The Afghan Deputy Defense Minister says he would prefer a negotiated end to the fighting.
As our fighting government leaders have repeatedly declared an appropriate, peaceful and flexible position, the first better way for the solution for ending this war is a peaceful way to find.
But there's no sign of realistic negotiations yet. Kabul is being turned into a heavily fortified camp, and armored patrols keep open the roads between the cities. Huge supply convoys are escorted through territory conceded to the Mujahideen. If the change of tactics noted this year is successful, it will allow the Soviet forces to hold fast inside their defenses. and only negotiate at a time and a pace of their choosing. For the moment, nobody seems to want to stop fighting.
Brian Hanrahan of the BBC reporting from...
The look of reconciliation in Afghanistan. Government troops under attack by Mujahideen rebels in Kandahar province near the Pakistani border. The Kabul regime has just proclaimed a new constitution it says can end the war. It isn't working. The war reaches to the heart of Kabul. This firefight took place just a few hundred yards from where that new constitution was being adopted. 11 people died. Mikhail Gorbachev has called Afghanistan a bleeding wound and wants out. But the war in Afghanistan rages on. President Reagan says it will be at the top of his summit agenda. Mikhail Gorbachev says his troops will stay until the United States stops supporting the rebels and they stop fighting. Afghanistan remains the one major point of superpower contention on which there has been no movement. The Soviets now say they'd pull out over a 12-month period if a ceasefire were agreed upon. In fact, Soviet and Afghan troops have come under increasing fire. The rebels have made devastating use of the U.S.-made Stinger missile. The government has won some people over. They've been supplying food and propaganda and organizing militias in some areas. But the ragtag collection of old men, young boys, and antique rifles is not a serious fighting force in a war dominated by helicopter gunships, jet bombers, rockets, and heavy artillery. Without Soviet firepower, Najibullah's so-called peace zones, and most observers think Najibullah himself, would not last long. A bloodbath is predicted if the Soviets were to pull out without a political agreement.
On the battle for Kandahar.
Across the dusty plains, mountains rise abruptly, a protective circle around the city of Kandahar. And here we found the first Soviet and Afghan army outposts, like islands in a sea of mujahideen. Tanks at ground level, lookouts high above the road, and the remains of a large Soviet fuel convoy ambushed some time ago. The mujahideen now move round and brush up against these defenses all the time. And it was across the road, just 100 meters from this Soviet position, that the mujahideen slip over to gain access to the city itself. Immediately, the extent of their hold on this area, only 4 kilometers from the city, became clear. Out of sight of the ever-watchful Soviet troops, they milled around, armed to the teeth, with weapons which still come across the border from neighboring and friendly Pakistan. Within the 3 kilometers or so between here and the city, we came across the scene of many a last-ditch stand by the Soviets and Afghan troops. This is the litter of war, left as they were pushed back in bitter close-quarter fighting over the past few years. We walked into the Kandahar suburbs with Ismail Gailani as senior leader in NIFA, the National Islamic Front for Afghanistan, one of the 7 mujahideen groups fighting the Soviets. He'd come on the long journey to meet military commanders from these other groups to try and persuade them to settle their differences in the fight against a common enemy. He harangued the meeting at length, gunfire all round, emphasizing the need for unity, but it's doubtful if the outcome was really as optimistic as Ismail Gailani suggested.
All of them says, yes, you're right. We haven't got anybody before to tell us the same things. Now you told us. Now we know when we are fighting together, that's better for us.
Do you think you're going to be able to take this place?
If we really want to fight against them, we free Afghanistan. Not only Kandahar, all Afghanistan.
Between prayers, the weapons are brought out. Here, a 72mm recoilless rifle made in China. Another Chinese weapon, copy of a Soviet 82mm gun. These are the weapons they've used to push both the Soviets and the Afghan army back into the strongly defended positions in the major cities. This then is Kandahar, or at least the old town. Thousands of people used to live here before the Russians came 9 years ago to smash it all with aerial and artillery bombardments. Now, only the Mujahideen live here, and fight, pinning their enemy down around the huge mosque which stands on the southern edge of the city. The Soviets, who were in the process of withdrawing their troops from Kandahar, have reversed that process. It's a sort of stalemate. The Soviets are disinclined to take the fight to the Mujahideen, who in turn seem content to keep up a steady harassment rather than an all-out attack. It's later on that leaders like Haji Latif hope to take the city from a demoralized government force once the Soviets have withdrawn completely. Some reinforcements moved along the road, but the Mujahideen failed to take advantage of this tempting target. The enemy was also engaged at much closer quarters amongst the ruins of the town. The Soviets have yet to lose an important population center, but if this city does fall under Mujahideen pressure, it will allow them to form a provisional government here, one which could be recognized by the Western powers, an important step along the road to replacing Kabul's communist regime with an Islamic government.